Hello, the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "There can be no doubt that morality will gradually perish. This is the great spectacle in 100 acts reserved for the next 2 centuries in Europe." And with chilling predictions like this, nihilism sped on its way. The hard view that morals are pointless, loyalty is a weakness, and truths are illusory. It's excited, confused, and appalled Western thinkers ever since. But what happened to Nietzsche's revolutionary ideas about truth, morality, and a life without meaning? Existentialism can claim lineage to Nietzsche, as can postmodernism, but then so can Nazism. With so many interpretations and claims of ownership from the left and the right, has anything positive come out of the great philosopher of nothing? With me to discuss Nietzsche and nihilism are the philosopher Rob Hopkins from the University of Birmingham, Professor Raymond Tallis, doctor, philosopher and a critic of the postmodernists, and also with us is one of their staunch defenders, Professor Catherine Belsey from the University of Cardiff. Let's talk first about Nietzsche and the Enlightenment. Nietzsche, the second half of the 19th century, German, Prussian, like his father, he died insane. Rob Hopkins, nihilism brings to mind despair and purposelessness and the love of destruction. How far are these central to Nietzsche's ideas?
They're central, though not in the way that he supported those views in the end. He thought nihilism was a phenomenon of enormous cultural importance that had marked the development of Western civilization at a certain crucial point, but he thought it was a form of sickness, reflecting deep, powerful pressures within Western society. And he thought that in the end this sickness had to be overcome. So his main goal was to try and understand what nihilism was, which was, as you say, the scepticism about morality having any justification, coupled to the thought that life itself has no meaning except any meaning we can give it, coupled to the idea that despair or some kind of abandonment of morality and values is the right reaction to have to those ideas. Nietzsche accepted a lot of that, but thought in the end you had to do something better. You had to find some more positive response to the thoughts that nihilism embodied.
He's generally regarded as somebody almost entirely destructive. You've mentioned the word positive. Can you tell us why you're bringing that in this early on?
Because Nietzsche thought of attitudes to big ideas, of major cultural movements, as essentially either life-affirming or life-denying. For him, Christianity was life-denying. It valued another world, the world of the eternal, over this world. It valued asceticism, denial of the self, over letting the self run free. It tried to destroy the forces he thought were most natural and valuable in human life, so it was life-denying. Likewise, in the end, he thinks science and the Enlightenment desire to know everything is, in a strange way, life-denying. And he thought if his philosophy
Why did you think that was a desire to know everything was life-denying?
Well, this is where things get a little complex.
Ordinary people would think that was, well, certainly not life-denying.
That's right, but Nietzsche thought it's partly because science is the heir of Christian rigour and honesty. And Nietzsche thinks that life is essentially deceitful, so that those who seek truth at any price are going against the values that life embodies for Nietzsche.
I see. Raymond Tallis, in The Will to Power, Nietzsche wrote, quote, "The highest values devalue themselves. The aim is lacking, and why finds no answer." What were these highest values he was talking about, and what does he mean by the highest values devalue themselves?
I think he's talking about two sorts of values. The values of renunciation that Rob has just referred to, those are Christian values, and also the value of the pursuit of disinterested truth, which had been characteristically the philosophical value throughout, or the value that had informed philosophical inquiry over the years. I think Rob's made a very good attempt to try and show Nietzsche as coherent, or indeed consistent, but actually most of Nietzsche's views are profoundly incoherent. The thing is, why has he been so attractive, and why has he attracted so many different people? And it's interesting that his incoherence is reflected in the very disparate sorts of people to whom he's appealed. I mean, what philosopher could be cited as an influence on George Bernard Shaw, Michel Foucault, Jack Kerouac, and so on? Clearly somebody whose views are very difficult to pin down. I mean, my own feeling about Nietzsche is that he's a bit like a Rorschach inkblot. You can read out of him what you put into him. But return to the theme of his incoherence, his whole attitude to the reevaluation of all values was profoundly incoherent, because he wasn't just throwing away highest values or extreme values, he was also throwing away bourgeois values, the ordinary values of decency and so on, and he'd hoped that, having created a sort of post-atomic wasteland, that he would create a brand new set of values. And the question is, where were those values going to come from? Well, alas, all they can come from is from basic appetites and instincts, and that is really where Nietzsche has been a great inspiration to some of the most appalling things that happened in the century after his death.
Well, I'm sure Rob Hopkins will want to come back to that, but at the moment, Catherine Balzi, nihilism as a term was first used in 1862 in the Russian novel Fathers and Sons. Do you think it belongs more to fiction than to philosophy?
I think it might. It's hard to imagine that there could really be somebody who subscribed to no values, no convictions, no commitments at all. It's hard to imagine the psychology of such a person, let alone the philosophical position. What would you have to say? The extraordinary thing is that in Fathers and Sons, the self-proclaimed nihilists are the sons who are reacting against the authority of their parents, and the sympathy is with the nihilists, but the nihilists turn out to be good Enlightenment figures. They're committed to science and knowledge. The hero is a medic who, in fact, dies on account of contracting typhoid from doing a post-mortem in order to advance his knowledge of medicine. So they're not, in fact, nihilists in the way that the word has come to be used. What happened, I think, was that when the notion had been created in fiction, then small groups of people in Russia began to call themselves nihilists for real.
Do you think that Nietzsche tried to live without illusions? And if he did, do you admire that?
I think I admire the refusal of dogma. I think you could see it in terms of a long tradition of a difference within Western philosophy, which would go right back to Plato and Socrates. Nietzsche's resistance to Platonism, to the systematicity and dogmaticity of Platonism, could be aligned with Socrates. Plato was the great systematizer. He had theories about how things were. He knew about the ideas in the mind of God, and he also imagined a republic in which he knew how things ought to be arranged in a utopian state. Socrates, on the other hand, sceptical, doubtful, questioning, always interrogating people's certainties and convictions, pushing them further back. And I think you could see the whole history of Western philosophy in terms of that opposition between those two figures. The ironic thing is that it was Socrates who was executed, not Plato. And you might say that if we'd got things the other way round, less damage would have been done. To that degree, I'd be with Nietzsche.
Rob, you've been sitting very quietly after the full frontal attack by Raymond Tallis on Nietzsche. You've been behaving very well, and not much of it has been pulled out. But would you like to respond to what he was saying?
Yeah, well, there are lots of things in what Raymond said. It's true that there are many conflicting strands in Nietzsche. It's true that he revels in these to some extent. It's possible that he thought that he was deliberately setting out to present conflicting strands to stress one of his own views, which is that if you just try and go for a nice, clean system, you end up with illusion. But I think, anyway, there are central strands in his thinking that can be reconciled one with another, and if you allow a bit for hyperbole and his devastating poetical twists and turns at various times and don't take them too literally, you get some kind of coherent body of thought.
Is there a sense, Catherine Balzi, that Nietzsche tried to kill off the Enlightenment and the idea of progress which the Enlightenment carried?
I think the Enlightenment itself, curiously, was a form of scepticism. But once that had settled down and been accepted for 200 years, it needed a new challenge. This is, in a way, how philosophy works, isn't it? That it constantly challenges existing dogmas. So, whereas, for example, Locke had secularized, I suppose, philosophy, had challenged the theocentric universe. So, at the end of the 19th century, the time had come, perhaps, to query the idea that there were foundations, grounds that you could appeal to, which would deliver truth. So what the Enlightenment had offered in place of God was various secular foundations, the moral law or reason or the laws of nature. And it seems to me that this will to truth that Nietzsche describes and deplores had maybe run its course in a way that made it necessary to rethink the basic questions again. And to that extent, it seems to me that what he's doing is far from sick, but is positively healthy.
Can I say something here? The will to truth, in a way, if you just say the will to truth has run its course, it sounds mad. Truth is the obvious goal of all inquiry. You can't just jettison it while continuing to inquire. So whatever Nietzsche meant by attacking the will to truth, it can't have just been the thought that there is something out there called truth which we might or might not want. If we're going to inquire at all, as the Enlightenment and anything post the Enlightenment suggests, you must aim your inquiries at something. The name for that thing is truth. Well, it's not an optional extra in this respect.
It's not so much, one of the problems is Nietzsche undermined the will to truth by seeing behind it the will to power. And in fact, he was very influential in the 20th century suspicion towards the whole idea of disinterested inquiry. And the reason for this lies in another of his metaphysical world pictures, which is it's written down in a small fragment, which I don't think he published in his life, called On Truth and Lie in an Extramoral Sense. And he offers us a fable. He says, on a remote planet, there was once a clever animal that invented knowledge. The remote planet is Earth, the clever animal is human beings. But of course, that knowledge wasn't about how things really were. That knowledge was a way of organising understanding of the universe to support the continuing life of that animal. The knowledge, if you like, was a form of adaptation to ensure biological survival. This knowledge wasn't about truth. Truth, what seems to be truth, is actually all about survival and indeed the will to power. And that, again, is a very fundamental, very influential aspect of Nietzsche, which is incoherent because, of course, he's offered us a model of the relationship between the will to truth and the will to power, which we are expected to accept is objectively true, or we reject it.
Taking up the will to power, in the will to power, Nietzsche wrote, quote, every belief considering something true is necessarily false because there's simply no true world. Rob Hopkins, what's your reaction to that?
When we talk about truth, we need to distinguish different things. We might be saying, when we're saying that there's no truth, we might be saying there is no thing of a certain kind. There's no independent world. It's quite separate from our beliefs, which it can conform to, and in that sense there's no truth. We might be saying that there is such a thing, but we can never grasp it. Or we might be saying there is such a thing and we could grasp it, but that shouldn't be the main dominant goal of our lives. I think Nietzsche was interested in all three of these ideas. I think Raymond's right that he did attack truth under the first respect. But notice that if you think there isn't truth in this sense of correspondence with a quite independently specifiable reality, it's still open to you to think that there is truth in another sense. Maybe it's the richness of the idea of truth that's the problem here, not the idea of truth itself.
Except that he wove truth in power when he said that truth is a mobile army of metaphors. And truth is the customary metaphor, and the metaphor becomes customary when it is adhered to by the most powerful group in society. So he was very much an ancestor of Foucault and people like that in this respect. So although I entirely accept your differentiation of different aspects or strata of truth, I think Nietzsche undermined the foundations of all of those three, but presented his ideas themselves as truths and thus was incoherent.
Catherine Valenti.
Rob says that the project of philosophy must be the pursuit of truth.
Any project of inquiry.
I'm very doubtful about whether we can have truth in any sense of the term that would be understood in ordinary language as meaning truth. It seems to me that there simply can be no certainty that the language in which we formulate truth matches the world about which we would tell the truth. And it seems to me that, whereas I don't think Nietzsche theorizes that, a great deal of philosophy in the 20th century has been concerned with problematizing that notion that we can have the truth. So if that is the goal of all inquiry, it seems to me that it might be doomed. And I'd like to suggest that we might put our goals somewhere else, somewhere that we could hope to get to.
But Nietzsche, in a way, I mean, he undermined even empirical truth. The famous response to the empiricists who said there are only facts, he said there are no such things as facts, there's only interpretations. And that could almost be a motto on cultural studies departments in many of the newer universities. But it seems to me that by this means, he put himself in a very awkward position. I mean, I do believe in one or two empirical truths. I confess at this moment, I believe, for example, that I'm in London. I believe, for example, that the sun is 93 million miles away from the Earth. I believe there are some major scientific truths. So I have no trouble with empirical truth. Nietzsche did.